Order. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, in my brief contribution, I'll be expressing my support for plain packaging of tobacco, making a few observations from the health perspective, obviously, and also acknowledging the good work done by my colleague Andrew Southcott and his work to pull together general agreement on this area, because it obviously raises elements of free trade, the extinguishment of IP for firms, the absolute preeminent objective of any government to reduce tobacco consumption, and complex issues around trademarks and also illegal importation of tobacco that can be a result of over-regulation of that industry. But all of those issues taken together, the one concern of any Australian government, be it whichever side of this chamber, should be to reduce tobacco consumption and smoking rates. And Australia has the best record in the world for achieving that. There's probably only 3 or 4 countries. I can think of Singapore, Sweden, possibly 1 or 2 others that have lower rates, although in the United States there's a handful of states that have lower tobacco daily consumption prevalence than Australia. So we do it pretty well, and that history goes right back to voluntary codes of conduct under the Menzies administration, efforts by the Fraser government and by Labor administrations since then. But one thing that is certain is that the great drops that were acknowledged internationally occurred under the Howard government in a series of sequential ratcheting down on tobacco consumption in Australia, including at the time the largest campaign in Australian history funding public awareness of the dangers of tobacco. What's interesting about this debate is that every time we approach a new forefront in tobacco control, everything that went before appears anachronistic, and I suspect that other nations will follow us on plain packaging if it proves to be one that doesn't extinguish IP and lead to significant challenges in the High Court. So my key point is that the one amendment that we are making to this legislation, and that is the ability to leave a small identifier not on the packet but on the package or the carton of cigarettes, be they a 4, a 6 or a 10, so that for easy stock tracking and identification, those working in small business can identify quite easily without relying on a simple font of small point, then it is a very, very good thing. And that amendment I would put my support behind, because obviously once that packet is opened, all of that branding is removed, and of course it's almost unheard of to buy cigarettes at retail level in Australia in packets, because of course there's no volume discount, unlike buying from overseas, where we sometimes do see these larger packets coming into the country. Of course, there is always the possibility that by plain packaging we make it a little easier for illicit tobacco, and we know there's been 743 million tonnes seized in the last 3 years by customs, and 200 million cigarettes also. But look, that's just an aside. We will deal with that problem when it comes along. The best problem you can have is fewer people smoking and more illicit stuff, because let's have that battle with the illicits when the time comes. But today is about what a government does in making tobacco as unattractive as possible, and I can see that fundamentally every individual has a right to purchase what they want. That hasn't been impeded, but certainly the great power of marketing through the brand will be nullified with this legislation, and it is worth a go. I won't stand here as probably the only health researcher in this chamber and say that we won't do this until we see the evidence. I think with tobacco the bar is fundamentally different. With tobacco there is no safe level of consumption. With tobacco we know it is highly, highly addictive, and with tobacco we know it has become socially acceptable by virtue of centuries where we could never link cause and effect. So were we able to do that, were the implications of tobacco realised an hour or a day after you smoked, tobacco would not exist in society. It is the latency in the time period, the temporal element between exposure and disease that leads tobacco to have this almost complete penetration through certain seams of society, with levels of smoking between 15 and 25%. I, in my interest of Indigenous health, have the concern about Indigenous levels of smoking. What we know is that these are still, right across urban, regional and remote Indigenous Australia, prevalences in excess of 50%. What disappointed me earlier this month was the Minister for Indigenous Health trumpeting a fall in smoking levels. And you only had to read the report from which this minister was quoting to see that the report itself said there is no significant change. But to be clutching at 1% and 2% changes and highlight them as success is disappointing, because it is a minister taking leave of the evidence in his own report. It's misleading to take a report and assign to it conclusions that simply are not supported by the very text that's in there. We need a minister who reads the report. We need a minister who says, cross-check that and show me exactly where that claim comes from. But what we are seeing is a pattern of behaviour, Deputy Speaker. It's a pattern of behaviour to whitewash over the data, to send it through Commonwealth departments and then allow these tiny little sound bites that somehow encourage the Australian people to believe we're making progress in Indigenous health. Because I say to you, I desperately want to see the progress, but I want to see the evidence. And if there isn't evidence for it, I don't want people to be misleading the Australian public. Now, you simply cannot take data from 3 jurisdictions and then quote it as a national trend. That is misleading. It was done repeatedly by this minister. I mean, it is simply wrong to take cardiovascular circulatory disease and say, we are delighted that there's a 29% decrease over that 10-year period of that study in Indigenous levels of cardiac disease mortality, when mainstream fell 35%, and you don't mention that. I mean, the gap might well have opened over the last 10 years, but here is a minister who can't acknowledge the possibility. And you only have to see if there's a 29% fall in Indigenous Australia and a 35% in mainstream, there's potentially a problem that needs funding and an address. But nothing is coming from this government, because we look at the Close the Gap that's been implemented with a highlighted, targeted area in smoking. Find for me in all that fine print an attempt to measure smoking levels in Indigenous Australia. You won't find it. Try and find for me evidence that there's fewer cigarette sales in Indigenous communities or Indigenous Australia. You won't find it. This is a government so determined to measure the irrelevant and to hide from the reality that I fear at the end of Close the Gap, not only won't it have closed, but not only will the gap not even be starting to close, that this government will feel it just has to tell a completely different story about Close the Gap, because you haven't got the evidence on the other side. Why? You're not collecting the data. You're not interested in whether Indigenous Australians are smoking less. You're not even counting. Instead, what you're measuring is the number of public health officials on the ground, the number of anti-smoking programs rolled out. Fabulous inputs, and they are absolutely necessary, but in no way sufficient to reduce smoking levels. So don't measure the stuff that doesn't matter. The critical element, the independent variable, is how many people are smoking. How much are they smoking? How many cigarettes are being sold? That's not even being counted. So how can you be serious about reducing smoking if in Indigenous Australia we have rates of over 50%, and most concerning of all, Indigenous pregnant mums with the same smoking rates? Unlike most of the rest of the world, no difference between the pregnant mums and the rest of Indigenous Australia. So there is one area where we genuinely have to focus. So in many ways this legislation, difficult to argue against. I think it's worth giving a go, and the reality is that there will be a slow and progressive ratcheting of pressure onto the tobacco industry, and this is just, in the footnote of history, another small move in that general direction. And I genuinely hope it works. I hope it succeeds. I'm prepared to give it a go. I can understand it might be a little harder for shopkeepers to identify stock sometimes, but I'm prepared to wear that in the interest of making it as unattractive as possible to smoke. And everyone listening here, both on the broadcast and in the gallery, will say, if you hate smoking that much, when are you going to ban it? But of course there's no discussion about that. When Marcia Langton makes the suggestion that if we care so much about alcohol consumption in pregnant mums, why don't we put them on a banned list? Are we that serious about it, or are we not? Well, here's a government that doesn't even have that debate. I'm not saying do it, but I'm saying let's consider some options. So emblematic of this legislation is these guys over here are fiddling with the packaging. And they have been preoccupied with the packaging for 12 months. Ever since they gave it up on Alcopops, it's been packaging. And doesn't that represent how far they've penetrated in this debate? Nowhere into cigarettes themselves, purely the packaging. So on my watch, I can say that we supported the removal of branding from cigarette packaging, from what is already 30% down effectively to simply a very, very simple font with a 14-point text. Let's see it work. Let's see if it's effective. I wonder about government entities deciding what is the uncoolest colour. There actually was someone paid to work this out. Someone was paid over here to work out what is the most unattractive colour for a packet of cigarettes. And what did they come up with? They came up, Deputy Speaker, with olive green. Well, I'll tell you one thing, today's uncool is tomorrow's cool. And someone who worked that out didn't realise that in the same month that they decided olive green, Porsche released their latest 912 Turbo. And what colour was it at the Melbourne show? What colour was it on the front of the magazine in The Australian? Olive green, Deputy Speaker. So before we get too smart about what colour we need to make a cigarette packet, let's focus on what's inside. Let's focus on whether we're serious about actually measuring what is happening both in the Australian public and, more importantly, Indigenous Australia. I finished where I started, 52, 53%. Sometimes it falls to 47% prevalence, but that is a major killer, Deputy Speaker, in Indigenous Australia. And I would like just 1/10 of the time spent quibbling over plain packaging, just 1/10 of the time spent trying to line this side up as if they're for big tobacco, you know, just because they receive political donations. I mean, if you don't like it, ban it, but no move over here to do that. If you don't like it, ban the sector, but no move to do that. Just quite happy to make a very cheap political point. But while they have their hands on the reins of government, this lot will be judged, Deputy Speaker, on what we've achieved in reducing smoking. My great fear is that all we achieve out of this Health Minister is plain packaging. And, you know, once that's done, it's like, whew, we've done alcopops and that's out of the way. We've done some plain packaging around tobacco and that's out of the way. Now let's just roll a bit more money into programs and don't measure anything too closely, just in case tobacco and smoking rates don't fall. The last thing we'd want the Australian people to know is it actually made no difference. So to be sure of that, let's not count anything. And this is the great problem, is that they don't mind going for the headline, an administration excellent at writing the press release, but then the rest of Australia scurries around trying to say, what are you trying to understand? What are they trying to achieve on here? Because it was government by press release for 3 years under the former Prime Minister, and now I fear it's government by headline grabbing. So you have bipartisan support, we'll give it a go. We'll see if it works. There should be no problem so long as IP is not extinguished. If it's extinguished, our only fear is not that the tobacco companies are going to make a swag of money. Our fear is that the Australian people have to pay for it. I mean, if there is a challenge in the High Court, Deputy Speaker, isn't it the case that if the government if the decision is awarded against the government, I would have understood it's the Australian people that pay for that. So if there was possibly a way of not extinguishing IP, but actually removing the branding from packets of cigarettes, this would have been wholeheartedly supported. And while I'm not a lawyer and can't give an opinion, Deputy Speaker, the fact is that under our amendment there will be a small amount of branding right on the end of the package that allows shopkeepers to find it, and by that element alone, IP is not extinguished. And it's a very, very important point to make. We are trying to save this government from its own legislation and from a High Court challenge, but we can't help them if they cannot help themselves. We will support the plain packaging. We hope that it makes a difference. We implore the government to count and see if it does, and most importantly of all, we would ask for way more than there has been already, more focus on Indigenous smoking, because up to now, through the Close the Gap objectives, we've seen a whole host of counting inputs, but precious little counting of outcomes.